Well, greetings everyone. We'll get started with our second Energy Bites. We won't have one next week because hopefully everyone will be tired from the forum on Tuesday. So we'll have a recover week and then we'll start again in 2 weeks for our next Energy Bites. We're excited. We kind of have a water-themed Energy Bites this week. We have a guest speaker from the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources. He's a postdoc. He's also associated with the Russel Ranch Sustainable Ag Facility. And it's Daoyuan, Wang. So we're excited to start with him, and then we'll move on to John Martindill, who's an Energy Graduate Group student, and he will talk second. So the clip, just flip this a little. Is the lighting good, or do you guys want lights on? Good? Good?
Hello everybody, I'm Daoyuan, and the title is slightly different from the flyer. So today I'm going to introduce some of our results from tomato irrigation management research. So I come to America in 2011, and my research was about how drought impacts soil microbial community. And one day in January 2012, my advisor came to the lab and said, Daoyuan, there's a real drought happening there, and you should go out and sample. And I look at the sky, and it's going to rain in the afternoon, so I biked to Russel Ranch, which is 10 miles away from the main campus, and took 30 kilograms of soil samples and bike back, and that's when I learned 10 miles is much longer than 10 kilometers. And now, as we all know, there was a drought for 5 years. And the groundwater level in a lot of regions dropped a lot. And even in our Russel Ranch Sustainable Agriculture Facility, we drilled a new well to get more water to be enough to irrigate our field. And still, we need to negotiate with the growers around us. Like, okay, you're going to irrigate tomorrow, right? So I'm going to get the water the day after. So then we realized that, well, before that, no one cares how much water they use, like in most cases, because water is cheap. Or if this land is yours, in a lot of cases, the water under it is yours. So people don't care. But after a couple years of drought, people start to realize that actually you need a lot of energy to pump the water, but the energy is really expensive. So if we can save water, we can also save energy. Well, during the past few years, a lot of very deep wells were drilled, and also I heard that they're really expensive. It may cost like $1 million per well, and also like you have to get in line and wait for a couple years to get your well done. So some mining companies said, okay, we're really good at drilling wells, but still, it's like a couple years wait. And also, according to California Public Utility Commission research, they find out in a drought year, it might increase the energy use of a grower for like 1/3 of energy for pumping water. As we all know, there's a climate change going on here, and the temporal and the spatial distribution of precipitation would change a lot, and more extreme weather like long-term drought is going to happen more and more frequently. So what can we do to reduce the water and energy use during a drought year is the question. So in the Russel Ranch Sustainable Agriculture Facility, and the name Russel is the Russel Boulevard. And if you go Russel Boulevard for like around 7.5 miles from here, you will see our beautiful Russel Ranch. And here's a really special landscape, and NASA even used the landscape to calibrate the satellites. And they had 3 sites there to calibrate for quite a few years. So we conducted 2 experiments. So since 2012, we started to convert our irrigation system from furrow to drip. So we realized we need to save water since we don't have enough water. So, but it takes a lot of resources to do that. So it took like 3 years to finish it. And by the time the research happens, half of our organically managed tomato is drip, and half of it is furrow. So we did a comparison of drip furrow irrigation in the organic tomato plots. And also we set up a processing tomato deficit irrigation experiment on the side of that field. So that's a research we collaborated with Powwow, and that's why we have Powwow in the title of this talk. So when we consider saving water, we also need to, the second problem comes, like, if we save water, have we already provided enough water for the crop to grow? Then we need, yes? Furrow irrigation is like you irrigate like once a week, just pumping water goes through the furrow. But the drip we used was subsurface drip, so you have a drip tape in the middle of a bed around 12 inches below your bed. And that irrigation is like around 5 days a week, like a couple hours every day. So the frequency and the water use is really different. So this is just pretty oversimplified system. So we need to know how much water is stored in the soil and how much water is evaporated from soil and how much water is transferred from the plants. So basically you need to know how much water is used by the plant and evaporated. And also you need to collect information about like temperature, radiation, precipitation. Like you need to understand the system, then to figure out how much water you're supposed to apply. And as we all know, the soil texture and the other soil properties could influence the water holding capacity of soil, and it varies a lot even within the same agricultural field. So according to the results of our drip furrow comparison, we found that in organic drip, the water productivity is almost like twice compared to the furrow irrigated field. So that's what we usually see. So after 25 years of organic management, our soil structure is perfect. And I probably shouldn't say that, it's not scientific. Also, the infiltration rate is very high. So when we started the furrow irrigation, the water might take like a whole day to get to the other end of the field. All the water just goes down. So it actually uses a lot of water if you do furrow irrigation. But it seems like converting the irrigation method is the first thing we can do. So if you convert to drip, we can save probably, well, according to the water productivity, we can save half of the water or use less water compared to the traditional furrow irrigation. And also we noticed that during the past 20 years in San Joaquin Valley, almost all the processing tomato growers have converted to drip. So everybody is trying to save water by converting their irrigation method. But it's kind of risky, or there's some challenges by once you go into drip, because as I mentioned, the soil texture is different, so the wetting pattern of your drip tape, like if you do a subsurface drip, the wetting pattern is different. So you need to make sure the wetting pattern actually covers where the root distributes. And if you get a sandy soil, it infiltrates much faster than the clayey soil. And also, here's just an example in 2016, a grower around us. So there's no way for a grower just to probe the soil and see how much water is in the soil, because it's like below, most of the wetting pattern is below the drip tape, so which is 24 inches. It's really hard to just probe. So when they see a dry field, they are like really worried, and they know some regions, some of their field is really sandy, and what they do is they just put a lot of water. So this field was mounted ET sensor, which the grower receives suggested irrigation hours every week. So this blue line is the suggested hours, but he put 20% more water to his field. So that seems like really easy to happen, even if you have an actual ET measurement in that exact field. So people want to, the growers want to know how much water is used by the crop and whether the crop is stressed and how much water I'm supposed to put next week, specifically for my field. So here's the sensors we used, try to figure out how the system should be set up and what information we need to get to precisely manage our field. So we have a flow meter in each of our land to, it comes with a data logger, so we can tell exactly how much water we put. And here's the water flow meter in our whole field, and this is the moisture sensor we use. Like we put moisture sensor at different depths, so we can figure out like how much water is in the soil and how it changed over time. And here's a Thule sensor, which is this is a startup company, and the founder is graduated from UC Davis, and his whole PhD research is about how to measure ETA. And after he graduated, he started his company and developed this sensor which can measure actual ET in the field. With those, and this is the Thule interface, which is very user-friendly. So this is the actual ET plus irrigation amount you put during the past few days or few months, and also the precipitation. And this is the evaluation of your crop development, so whether your crop is doing good or not. So as you can see here, seems like our field is not doing very well. It dropped here, but we started our deficit irrigation here, so that's why. So they detected we put less water, but this is our crop did fine. So we collaborated with Dr. Tim Hartz. He did a lot of work in tomato irrigation, and the one thing he did is try to reduce the amount of water used in processing tomato production. At the very beginning of drip irrigation, people start to realize when they increase their yield, it comes with a drop in the soluble solid content. So as we all know, the processing the soluble solid content is very important for processing tomato because we use them for jam, and we need a lot of soluble solid in it. So basically, the Brix yield, which is the sugar yield, is not increased. Then people start to think maybe we can reduce the water use and generate water stress. Then the crop would stop pumping water to the green fruits, and then the like already ripened red fruits will have a higher sugar content. But it's really hard to treat when you reduce your irrigation, because if you reduce your irrigation much earlier, you are going to jeopardize your whole yield. But if it's too late, it's not enough to generate enough stress to increase the sugar content. So that's why we did this late season deficit irrigation experiment to figure out how much less water we are supposed to put to generate this stress, and how much stress can the plants tolerate. And here's what we did. We have 4 treatments, 100 ETA, which is following the actual ET measurements and give the plants sufficient water, and then reduce it to 80%, 60% down to 40% irrigation, starting July the 17th, which is each of the plant has a pink fruit, which means the fruit generation is already stopped, and then they start to ripen. Yes?
Sorry, could you define ET?
It's the evapotranspiration. It's the total amount of the evaporation from the soil and also the amount of water used by the plant. Well, the 2D sensor uses the moisture content in the air to estimate ET. So if you want to measure the actual ET, you need to install a lysimeter to weigh the whole thing to figure out how much water is lost. But most of the ET measurements are estimated ET. And you can also use the reference ET to calculate your actual ET, but it's kind of hard to determine.
I see. So you're measuring the ambient conditions and essentially estimating how much water the plants will be evaporating.
And also monitoring the canopy development of the plants.
So it's like some sort of like.
It's a moisture sensor in the air.
Okay.
I understand. So like 100% ETA, that means that you're giving the plant the maximum amount of water that it could use to photosynthesize.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you were to give it any more water, it just wouldn't even use it because it can't process any more water.
In the 100% ET, we made sure there's enough water for plants. But I didn't think about what's going to happen if we overwater the plants, but it's a great question. What we're trying to do here is to see like whether we can generate enough stress to change the sugar content in the fruits and whether we overdone it. And the hypothesis is 40% is too much here. So if we blow the orange circle here, that's what we did. So in the 40% ET treatment, we put 3.2 inch less water within 4 weeks late season compared to the actual ET measurement. And here's our fruit results. And this is the Brix content after 4 weeks of deficit irrigation. And as we can see, the 40% and 60% ETAs treatments already got higher sugar content compared to the 100%. We also measured before the deficit irrigation happened, and they're all the same. So, which means we did generate water stress to the plants. So if we look at the soil moisture content, the surface soil always had a really dramatic change, so it changed every day. But if you want to generate water stress to tomato, you have to change the moisture content down to 18 inches. So, which means you need the plant to start to use the water storage in the soil instead of just use the water coming from the drip tape. So that's why we did this different treatments. And here's the yield difference, and seems like even 40% ETA didn't change the tomato yield. And if we look at the Brix yield, it also had the same, like there's no significant differences among all those 4 treatments. So here's the summary. With the help of all those sensors, we did generate water stress to the tomato plants, and we saved around 87 gallons of water per acre, and without jeopardizing tomato yield. And also with this higher sugar content, it can also reduce the associated energy used in the processing and the transportation. And seems like under most of the situation, 50% ETA starting 6 weeks before harvest would be like the plants would tolerate that amount of water reduce in processing tomato production. And I would like to thank my collaborators and funders, and thank you for your attention, and I will take any questions. It's an anomaly, and we don't have direct evidence to explain it. And if we look at the Brix yield, it's not significantly different from the control.
Okay.
So
it's not actually like some weird trend.
And we did 2 years of field study, and we didn't see this trend in the first year, so we thought it's just something random happened. So we used a lot of sensors. So well, it's kind of challenging to control water. We used a pressure regulator to reduce the water application in the first year, but it didn't work. And then we have to install flow meters in each row so we know exactly how much water went in. And also, well, the 2D sensor, we just used one in the whole field. And moisture sensors at 4 depths, but we need to be representative to the whole field, so we measured, we put a bunch of them
If you were like
across.
a tomato grower and you wanted to apply this knowledge, how many sensors?
That's a good question. So if the scale is large enough, you can find a representative spot and set up those sensors. So it doesn't have to be that many, and you don't have to do multiple treatments. And well, to simplify it, you can put, for example, moisture sensor, you can put it down to 18 inches or 24 inches just to see whether the moisture content changed. Thank you.
The clip's a little broken, so it takes something extra a little bit more.
Yeah, it doesn't really stay. Yeah. Can you all hear me? Yeah, we're good? Good to go? All right. Thank you all for coming out today. Hearing us talk about irrigation. My presentation is it's in a very similar field. I'm talking about agriculture irrigation, I'm talking about crop water use, but very different context. But I'm really glad your presentation went first because it'll actually help me talk about a few things. But the goal of my project was to estimate on a large scale agricultural water use using energy data. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you some context of what I'm calling the California data landscape. That is the data that's available to me to perform this estimation. I'm going to talk about the efficiency lift method, which is sort of the tool that we use to convert energy data into estimates of groundwater extraction. And then I'm finally going to identify and talk about the best combination of methods and data sources to get the most accurate estimate of groundwater use using the efficiency lift method. This project was funded by the Department of Water Resources. We also partnered with the Angiola Water District, which is the small water district in the Tule Lake subbasin. So it's down south in the Central Valley. And this study was done by the Center for Water Energy Efficiency. I mean, it was done by mostly me, but working for the Center for Water Energy Efficiency. So just to give some background, in 2014, California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA. And one of the things it does is it prioritizes groundwater subbasins and basins for active management. And in order to manage those basins, it establishes these local groundwater sustainability agencies. And these agencies, for their budgets, need to develop a water budget for their basin and develop a plan for how they're going to regulate and reduce groundwater use to meet that budget. So that budget has two components. That has how much water is being extracted, taken out, and then how quickly does this groundwater basin recharge. And so you want to match those two, and that's your sustainable groundwater use. So for all of the basins here highlighted, the ones purple are the critically overdrafted basin. Orange is high priority, yellow is medium priority. These agencies are being formed, and they're trying to estimate how much water is being used and how quickly this recharges. It just so happens that in this area, agriculture is by far the biggest user of groundwater use, 80 to 90%, in these critically overdrafted areas. So really, it's understanding how much agriculture is pulling out of the ground and how to manage agricultural groundwater use. In order to do this, like I said, they need to know how much water is being pulled out. The best way to do that is with flow meters, and because you're actually measuring the water flow. But flow meters are kind of expensive. Farmers don't have them already, or at least not all of them do, and there's no regulation in place that would allow these GSAs to require these individuals to install flow meters. So the current recommended approach is to use this model called C2V Sim, and it simulates all water flows in the Central Valley. And it calculates groundwater withdrawals first by looking at expected crop demand. And so that's looking at this sort of climate parameters, it's looking at expected crop coverage. You know, we think there's almonds here, we think it's this temperature and this humidity, and so this is what we'd expect farmers to apply. Just sort of in a assume the irrigation method, sort of all of that aside, you know, we're not looking at an individual farmer behavior at all. So we have expected crop demand, and we're subtracting from that the precipitation that we've measured, an estimate of the soil moisture content, and estimates of surface water diversion. So, you know, we're looking at stream flows, we're looking at state water project deliveries. So, and just taking the difference of that, C2V Sim would say that's what we're expecting is the groundwater withdrawal in this area. And so we kind of look at this and say that's probably not the most accurate. At least it's not very precise because there's so much variance. And you can look at these sort of grids here, these polygons, that's the analysis unit of C2V Sim. So for all of these fields in this polygon, we're estimating, you know, what's the crop water demand that we expect, what's the precipitation, what's the surface water diversion, and you know, whatever that difference is, that's the groundwater demand in that polygon. Now, the issues with this method is largely that, you know, so there's all those assumptions that go into it, and there's that, you know, the groundwater withdrawals, we have no way to really verify whether that's accurate at all. So trying to develop policy using this could potentially lead to some problems. This is the efficiency lift method. And so this is just a really basic physical equation that says if you look at a pump and you multiply the energy use of that pump by the efficiency of that pump, divide it by the total dynamic head and this constant, you will get the groundwater yield. And that's just a true relationship. Where the challenge gets into, it is with the data that you have. Pump efficiency, how efficient the pump is operating, that varies over time. Total dynamic head, which is the vertical distance that you're pumping the water, that varies over time. Just to get a bit more into total dynamic head. So there's actually really three components. So there's the actual depth to groundwater, that's the surface elevation compared to where the top of the aquifer is. There's drawdown, and there's other pressure and friction losses that add to the total vertical distance. And so if we're looking at a cross-section of a well pump, that vertical distance there from the surface to the static water level is depth to groundwater. As you pump, the water level in your well shafts goes down, and that dries out the area immediately around the well shaft. And you get a cone of depression, and that additional vertical distance is the drawdown. And finally, the well pump that you're running may be pressurizing a system down the road, which adds pressure, that adds head. And in addition, there's also friction loss throughout the whole system. So all that together is the total dynamic head. So now we've talked about the efficiency lift equation, it's time to talk about the data that goes into it. So one really crucial component of it is the energy data. Historically, this has not been very available. But in 2014, the California Public Utilities Commission passed a resolution establishing the California Energy Data Request Program that makes individual account level energy data available to academic institutions. So SWE was able to request energy data for these pumps in Angiola in order to run this efficiency lift method. Non-academic institutions can also request data, but it can't be individual level. So there is application to this outside of academia, but this will be the academic approach that I'm presenting here. Now for the other components, so pump efficiency and total dynamic head, the conditions that the pump is operating in, we have a few options for data sources. There's pump test reports, groundwater level data sets, and regional averages. And these sort of map to the components of the equation here. Groundwater level data sets only tell us about depth of groundwater, but that's really important because that's usually the biggest component of TDH. Pump test reports and regional averages give us input onto everything about the pump operating parameter. And then the energy data request program gives us the energy data. So pump test reports, farmers get these done at regular intervals, could be once every 2 years or something like that. And somebody comes out and runs some tests on the pump to determine how efficient it is and what the depth is and other sort of parameters. Usually they're done to sort of gauge the health of the pump, whether it needs maintenance. But for our purposes, they tell us everything we need to know to run this. The challenge that they present is that it's kind of difficult to obtain these on a really large scale. In our case, in this study, we were able to do that because we're dealing with a small water district. But if you want to do this for the entire state of California, you're looking at gathering tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of pump test reports. That might not be very feasible. There are also these groundwater level data sets. So CASGIM is this data set maintained by the Department of Water Resources. They have thousands of test wells throughout California, and they regularly test the depth of those wells, and they publish that on an online database. And so this is a really easy data source to use that can allow us to estimate the depth to groundwater anywhere in the state at really any time. DWR also publishes their own sort of summary of this data in the form of contour maps, and they give those for twice a year in spring and in fall. And so this is sort of easier to use in that the groundwater level at every point is already estimated for us, but the coverage isn't complete, and we ran into some issues with the accuracy. Finally, there was a large survey done of pump test reports in the Central Valley of California. 15,000 pump test reports were collected by the Irrigation Training and Research Center at Cal Poly, and they published a lot of summaries of this data. And one of those summaries was regional averages on the sub-basin level, saying this is the average TDH, this is the average pump efficiency, and so on. So our goal was to take all these data sources, apply them to each of these in different combinations, and come up with what the best method was. So just to kind of step through and how we applied them. So first, looking at just pump efficiency, we had pump test reports, and we could apply the measured pump test report for each well in our studied area to each well as we performed the efficiency lift method. So that's the most specific. Then we used the results of the survey. We did some estimations around relationships. You can look at, there's a relationship between the size of the pump and how efficient it is, or how deep the well is and how efficient the pump is. And so we took all that data and we made a regression equation to say, if we know some things about the pump, what can we predict is the efficiency? And so that's sort of our calculated approach here. And then finally, we could use the regional average. For depth to groundwater, again, we have the pump test reports, giving that to us specifically by well. We have CASGIM that I mentioned, and this is sort of, the black there is Angiola Water District, and we used all of the highlighted red wells from CASGIM to do sort of a linearly and temporally weighted estimate for well depth for wells in the measurement wells we were looking at in in Angiola. And finally, there was also the Dwr Contour Map, as I mentioned before. This was the coverage we had, so it didn't cover all of Angiola, and the estimates it gave us were very different from our other data sources, and so we ended up excluding it because the error that it gave us was so high. And finally, regional averages again. The last one, so drawdown, again, pump test reports. For our calculated approach, we use the Theus equation, which is an equation where you look at the conditions of the aquifer and you look at the pump itself and what's the flow of the pump and how long has it been pumping for, and that tells you an estimate for what the drawdown is. And so we were able to kind of come up with estimates for each component of this equation to give us sort of this, if we didn't have access to a pump test report, this would be our estimate for what a drawdown would be for each well. And again, finally, regional averages. So combining all of these data sources at varying levels of specificity, we created 5 data specificity scenarios. The first one we're calling individual pump tests. So this is if you can get pump test reports for every single well that you're trying to estimate for. You just use the results of those pump test reports to calculate the ELM. So you're using that pump efficiency and TDH that was measured at every single well. To simulate a situation where maybe you collect a representative sample of pump test reports, but maybe not all of them for your study area, we have this scenario, average pump test reports. So we just averaged all of the values. So we took an average pump efficiency in Angiola and applied that to every well, and an average TDH, and we applied that to every well. Our third is calculated, and so that's using that Theus equation to estimate groundwater depth, drawdown, using CASGEM to estimate groundwater depth, and using our regression model to estimate pump efficiency. The CASGEM and regional approach, so we use CASGEM for well depth and then regional averages for everything else. Again, we like that CASGEM estimate for groundwater depth because that's the biggest component of TDH, so it's kind of worth testing that separately from the all-regional approach where we just use regional estimates for everything. And so this gives us 5 data specificity scenarios that are also summarized in this graphic. And these are some initial results. So we can see that the efficiency lift method using these data inputs tracked really well with the measured groundwater use. We had flow meters installed on these wells, so we were able to compare the ELM estimate with what was measured. But we do see a kind of a trend of overestimation. The individual tests didn't really overestimate too much, but the calculated approach and the all-regional approaches overestimated it a lot. So our calculated pump efficiencies were a little bit too high on average, and so this is estimated versus measured pump efficiency. If we were perfect at estimating, everything would be right along this 45-degree line. Everything above it is an overestimate. But compared to the regional average, we improved. So the regional average there would have been a really large overestimate. But instead, using this regression, we really improved our estimates for the pump efficiency. Similarly, the regional averages they underestimated TDH. And so if we go back, we look at the equation up here. If we are overestimating pump efficiency and underestimating TDH, those are both going to skew our estimates for groundwater yield too high. But because I'm not too concerned about this finding for the regional averages, because Angiola is really small compared to the size of the region that we got that for. So this could sort of be a blip. Maybe Angiola is slightly biased in one direction for the region, but if we're repeating this on a region-wide scale, this issue might not repeat. Now, also, and this is not a fair comparison, but C2V sim that I mentioned before, with those sort of large polygons where this estimation is generated, we use that data to simulate the C2V sim estimate. Now, C2V sim wasn't designed to estimate groundwater yield in a really small area. It's designed to do that over a much larger area. So it's not a fair comparison, but it highlights something important, which is that while our estimates track really closely with what measured water use is, The C2V sim, which is the red line, kind of follows its own pattern based on expectations of farmer behavior. Some more results. So in terms of what approach is best. So if you're going to estimate groundwater extraction for individual wells, you really need those individual pump test reports to do that accurately. So this is monthly estimate error. So on average, using individual tests, we had a 13.5% error, which is, fairly high, maybe not the most accurate. When we didn't need to do monthly estimates, we just aggregated it to annual estimates. That improved a lot. So we were able to get our error down to 5% for an individual pump. We had a 5% error on average if we could apply those individual pump tests. The calculated approach, which is you don't have access to any pump test reports, we got about a 10% error. And just to show how that annualizing helps, the left is our estimated versus actual water use on the monthly basis, and the right has that on the annual basis. And so much more agreement when we aggregate that way. It's worth mentioning that what we're calling the actual water use is based on flow meters, but flow meters have their own error rates. In fact, an error rate of about 5% would be considered pretty good for a flow meter installed in this situation. So getting down to about a 5% error for our annual estimates might be about as good as we can really hope for. Finally, if you don't care about the individual well, and instead you want to estimate the extractions from a large collection of pumps, we found that you don't really need to apply individual pump test reports to individual pumps. In fact, taking the averaged pump test reports gave us the lowest error at around 3.5%. So, our main findings. Specific data sources, pump test reports, are pretty much needed if you want to do individual well estimates. But if you aggregate over time and space, you really improve your accuracy and you reduce your need for that specificity. And we know that ELM is more precise than C2V sim, but whether it's more accurate over a large scale is yet to be seen. And the potential for use for this process of data gathering and applying the ELM. So obviously you can do the basin and sub-basin level estimates of groundwater withdrawal. You can get down to maybe 3% with error with the right data. But we should do some more research on that at that larger scale. You can also do farm level estimates of groundwater withdrawal. You can get down to a 4 or 5% error with the right data. Another application is lifecycle analysis of food systems. If you have an idea for how much water is being used to generate a particular crop and you know where it's being grown, you can use this equation the other direction to estimate pretty accurately the energy use that's going into growing that food. The next steps, we are currently in talks with DWR to get that larger scale replication of this funded. That'll give us a better comparison with C2V sim, and that'll give us an understanding of whether the regional estimates for the pump parameters are more applicable. And then after that, if that's successful, I think we're going to go on to develop a statewide model that those groundwater sustainability agencies can use when they're trying to develop those water budgets and to track their progress towards meeting their sustainability goals. This work was done under Frank Loge, who's the PI of the center, and myself, and this is our contact information. Thank you.
Did you look at annual protection using CTV sim versus? It seemed to underestimate and overestimate.
It did, yeah. The annual error was still higher than every scenario we tested. The error for C2V sim was something like 25%. I had that on before, but I took it off because the comparison is so unfair that I just kind of wanted to give something a little bit more qualitative.
How are the polygons determined for the CTV sim?
I don't know. There's a report that I could send your way that kind of goes into more detail on that. But yeah, I don't know. Sure, great.
So I noticed that both for TestGem and the Contour Map, it seems like there was this big hole in the test data like right around the Martindill water district. The test wells were there were no
So for CASGIM, the coverage is just really inconsistent. It did seem like there was a bit of a gap around that area, and especially extending down to the southwest. And I think that's just an area that's not really used for agriculture. So maybe Angiola is sort of on the edge of this agricultural area with a lot of wells. That would be my best guess, and I would imagine that would have some impact on the accuracy of the estimates. Yeah, I mean, exactly like the regulatory tools that are going to be applied, I don't know. But yeah, that's Sigma is sort of requiring that we move in that direction.
It just seems like if that's
Yeah, and that does seem likely. So it's possible that this will only be sort of an interim method for estimating sort of these large-scale withdrawals, and that someday, yeah, we may just see flow meters rolled out, but that day is not today.
Slight overestimation is better than the
Yeah, I mean, but that just could be a local effect. It could be that, because it's an overestimation because our sort of, the data sources we used were sort of based on a regional or a collection of results from a lot of wells. And so it could just be that Angiola wells are particularly inefficient and or particularly high TDH compared to their region. So I don't know if we'll continue to see that in the next study. Okay. Thank you all for coming.